So what I'm trying to emphasize is that the TRIPS exception, public health exception, is actually very, very restrictive. The second example I'd like to give is what Clinton's global initiative did around 8 years ago. He was trying, so other governments through the WTO forced the Indian government to strengthen intellectual property rights in India around 2005, if I'm not mistaken. And the result of that was that India could no longer export its generics. So the Indian generics, antiretrovirals and other things which are being exported to Africa, where many countries simply do not have the expertise, the capacity to manufacture those things themselves, or there's simply no economies of scale because of the of the size of these countries. So you basically were preventing Indians from exporting, and so Clinton basically recognized the situation, bought a couple of property rights for antiretrovirals and started manufacturing in India, which, because he had the rights, he was allowed to export. So the third, I'm already running out of time, I'm told. The third is hepatitis C. Okay, something which is quite widespread in my country, which has a population of slightly over 30 million. 500,000 people have hepatitis C. The Hep C treatment in the United States costs 68,000 US. Okay, for a 12-week treatment. The generic from many countries produce generics, India, Bangladesh, Egypt. The Egyptian generic costs the equivalent of slightly over 300 US. Okay, 300 versus 68,000. Okay, that's the kind of price gouging. And as I mentioned earlier in the example of Loretta Lynch could only prosecute him for running, Shkreli for running a Ponzi scheme, because there was no way. Price gouging is not a crime in this country. And so this is a problem, and what this country does becomes the rules for the world. Okay, and we have to recognize this. The last example I want to make is Obama was pushing for this TPP. Among the provisions of the TPP and what the Japanese and Australians are now pushing for are provisions for biologics. Okay, naturally occurring substances, the rights to them can be owned. So just imagine insulin. Insulin is found from pigs. Diabetics need it, etc., etc. All that can now be privately owned if subject to certain qualifications. Now, since I'm running out, let me quickly move on. The third point I'd like to make is what is this? Is financialization just more of the same? And I would like to argue that analytically, it is important to recognize the changes which have taken place, particularly with the end of Glass-Steagall and the change of the so-called universal banking. Also, very, very importantly, the development of what is called shadow banking. And so there's a qualitative change as well. It's not just simply a quantitative change of more finance and more financial rents being extracted from the system. I don't have time to elaborate. Let me make a fourth point, is that increasingly what is called direct investment as opposed to portfolio investment actually constitutes acquisitions and mergers, which is actually more of portfolio investment, except it is writ large. So I think we have to be very, very careful about numbers when we look at them and how we measure them, including foreign direct investment numbers. So one of the important things, of course, is that in some countries like this country, you have NASDAQ, you had venture capital arrangements, as we have heard about, but in most countries, they simply do not exist. Okay, and this, I think, is a major problem. The last point I'm going to make is that we all talked about states and governments doing more, but fiscal capacities have been greatly diminished over the last 4 decades. So what can be done in this situation? I think in the past, one of the problems with collecting more taxes was that the US had a system where you have universal taxation of corporations registered in this country. whereas the rest of the world was sort of talking about location and so on and so forth. Now, the OECD has a proposal which is, in my view, still problematic, okay, because of a number of things. It discriminates basically against developing countries where there are a number of considerations. Without going into details, there's the report of the commission which Ocampo, who was supposed to chair the last session, basically has, and that's a very, very important thing. So it's a big struggle, except that unfortunately very few developing countries, including those who used to articulate these issues, such as India, are not beginning to articulate. One important element of it is taxation of the digitization and digital-related activities, which has been the preoccupation of much which needs to be done. So for those who have any influence in government, I guess I'm looking at people like Ayanda, but I'm sure there are others as well. The very, very crucial thing is to ensure that the OECD proposal is modified. There are some good elements in the OECD proposal, but there are also other elements which are discriminatory against developing countries, and we need to have modification of that in order to have any significant change in terms of the conversation on corporate taxation and strengthening the fiscal capacities of developing countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jomo. I'm now going to hand over to Mandeep Dalilal from the Undp Bureau.
I thought Kelly was going to do next.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
That's okay. No one told
Yes,
you.
okay. We'll do it that way. I thought. I misunderstood. So now I'm going to hand over to Kelly Lee. We're very interested to be hearing what we were looking forward to yesterday. We've been waiting in great anticipation to hear your remarks.
I better make it worthwhile.
Yes, good.
Yeah. Okay.
Sorry.
Thank you. That's it. Yeah. Well, thanks for the opportunity and the second chance to present my talk. I entitled it Health or Hell. And if you're a self-confessed science fiction fan like I am, you'll recognize the reference in my title is to HAL 9000, who was an artificially intelligent computer in the iconic novel and film 2001 Space Odyssey by Stanley Kubrick back in 1968. So well done if you recognize that. The computer was tasked with transporting a spacecraft to Jupiter in the story, and Hal was the computer who ran the ship and interfaced with the crew with this very kind male voice, very gentle voice. He controlled the ship, and he was all-seeing and knowing, almost like godlike, really. For those of you who've not seen the film, spoiler alert, it doesn't really go very well, so I'll just say that. One of the core themes, I'll just forward that, there's the film. One of the core themes of the film is a familiar one in science fiction, and that is the relationship between human beings and technology. For dramatic effect, science fiction tends to make this relationship often a troubled one. And the use of technology is central to many science fiction novels. It distinguishes us, technology, as human beings from other animals. It presumably elevates us and so on. But it's a double-edged sword, as we know. It's in the iconic scene in the film. Again, if you haven't seen it, there's this key scene at the start of the film, known as the Dawn of Man, where an ape, a primate, discovers the first use of technology. The scene is quite sobering because this discovery hints at the use of technology for violence and for destruction. And the film also suggests some greater powers at play. So there's a lot of complex themes going on in the film. It's not always clear who is in control then. That's what my point is, whether it's the humans, the technology, or something else. And really, this is the theme of my talk, the relationship between humans and technology and who is really in control. And it's a timely conversation that we're having this week at this moment in history, when many of the technologies that are imagined in science fiction are actually on our doorstep. Artificial intelligence, we've already talked about, digital technologies, robotics, and biotechnology. These technologies are offering unprecedented opportunities for us to improve human health and well-being very exciting. And most of us, certainly those of us of a certain age, are watching these very carefully. And they are really significant in history. So Klaus Schwab, who's the executive chairman of the World Economic Forum, describes that we are currently living in what's known as the fourth industrial revolution. And I quote him, "We stand on the brink of a technological revolution that will fundamentally alter the way we live, work, and relate to one another. In its scale, scope, and complexity, the transformation will be unlike anything humankind has experienced before." So that's profoundly exciting, but also very sobering in terms of this period in time. So we've heard some really excellent presentations. I've really learned a lot. Thank you so much. And most of them challenge the assumption that technologies are necessarily progressive, that they need far more critical reflection. And I certainly agree with that. And indeed, some of the advances we're hearing in health sciences, cloning, gene editing, tissue bioengineering, 3D printing of body parts, and what I heard the other week, the development of artificial wombs, all of these things are quite unsettling as well. These technologies often start with well-intended motives, and they end up, somewhere else. So they are transformative and disruptive, but it's not always clear what that actually means. So we hardly have time to have these conversations, and the technologies are moving at a very rapid pace. So this week, as I say, is extremely important for having those conversations. To bring together our conversations over the last couple of days, it was suggested by me, actually, Sakiko, you suggested this concept of power asymmetries. It would be a useful one to think about. So I went away and I thought about it. And so I'm going back to report back. It's a concept that is from business studies, but also political science. So it kind of bridges the two areas that we're interested in terms of governance of new technologies. It really means that it's about power asymmetries are differences in status, authority, or capacity between individuals or groups of individuals, such that these differences result in differential ability to act. So that's the academic version anyway. The classic example is, of course, Queen Marie Antoinette, who told the starving French peasants, let them eat cake, assuming that they had the same capacity as she did. Maybe a more recent example is when President Trump gave this tone-deaf advice to federal workers during the U.S. government shutdown earlier this year. I can relate, he said. I'm sure that the people that are on the receiving end will make adjustments. They always do. And that was his quote. So why are power asymmetries important for us to understand? Well, because they lie at the heart of decision-making about what technology, for whom, by whom, and where. Those who possess greater power will have a greater ability to decide the answers to those important questions. And who are the powerful? Well, we've talked a lot about it this week already, so I won't go into too much more detail. There are 50 top companies in the tech industry. These are them. And we know that they dominate hardware and equipment, software and applications, media, retailing, and so on. Top 5, Facebook, Google, Apple, Microsoft, and Amazon. Some are now being asked to account for their dominance, for their enormous power, their data security breaches, their antitrust practices, and tax evasion. And alongside this economic might, we also need to understand how these big players shape how we think about technology, how we actually even envision what technology should do for us. So power asymmetries are really very much embedded in the technologies themselves. They're not just who controls them, but who actually comes up with these technologies and how these power asymmetries are embedded within them. So it's important to recognize that power asymmetries are not just about the material power of these powerful actors. It's about also their, how they're embedded in the institutional structures that govern their application, their financing, their creation, and so on. And this, I'm not going to go into this diagram, but it really shows the complexity of the different types. So this week has actually brought me back a little bit to my days as a PhD student. I started out studying the International Telecommunication Union, which is the specialized agency for telecommunications. It's the equivalent to WHO. And that's my first book. It was my PhD thesis. And really, it was about allocating a scarce resource. And generally, people thought of the ITU as this really technical body. It was, a bit like how WHO used to be thought of, just a technical body, keep those politics out of, discussions. And in reality, what I've shown in my thesis is that actually it's a highly political process. And so what I would argue in this very brief talk is that how we govern and how we have distribution of power within that governance system is really important for how effective the governance is. So in this diagram, which comes from the World Development Report a couple of years ago, it shows that when you have power asymmetries, you have actually poor governance outcomes. And that's something that is, this is where actually all sides would benefit from better governance. And the other important point, and I'm sorry I don't have time to give you this really cool example, but it's not just about power symmetries or asymmetries. It's unlikely we're going to just solve power asymmetries and create symmetry. We're all going to have roughly similar power. But what we can do is find ways of moving beyond that. And the literature shows that if you can find goal congruence, which is what is shown in this diagram, goes so fast the time, isn't it? That then we can find ways of governing that's kind of a win-win. And I had a great example about boarding aircraft, and I don't have time to do that. So I'll just, can I give my example? It's such a good one. All right, so, my example is that how do we find a governance mechanism when you have different interests based on goal congruence? So if a lot of you are going to go board an aircraft in a few hours. So the goal congruence is that the airline wants to board the aircraft as quickly as possible to avoid any penalties for taking off late, keeping their customers happy, maximizing profit ultimately. As passengers, we also want to board quickly, but we also want to do it safely. And we want to do it in a way that will get us to our next destination as quickly as possible. So there are lots of different ways to board an aircraft, as you know. First come, first served could be one. If you take a cruise, you have a certain period of time, you have to be at the ship, and people just get on as they arrive. Very, very leisurely, very comfortably. We could have a lottery system, whoever pulls a name out of a hat or whatever, and you just get on board. That's one way. If they don't use that, I have to say. There could be economic entitlement, and which is where you pay more, and you can get on first or get on priority boarding. Physical capability is another one, where people with children or older people or people with physical need assistance can board with priority. Logistical rationale, you could board by row from the back of the plane, right? And then my personal favorite, competition. So you just blow a whistle, and then only the first 200 get on, and the others, they have to stay behind. So that's probably maybe not so safe. But what I'm saying is that both parties have an interest in boarding the plane quickly and safely. There's lots of different ways to do it, and in fact, in reality, there's a combination of those. Not the blowing the whistle, but there's other ones where people get on, and then the plane takes off. And in fact, the plane cannot take off till everybody's on the plane. So it's like society. We can't take off in a society unless we have everybody on the plane. We can't leave people behind. And so the rules that, what the example shows is that we can find ways without polarizing governance to serve one interest or the other. And at this point, we're not there. And so that really is the key point. So I'm going to just skip to the end point, which is my summary. Who is in control is really important in finding those answers, and how we take apart who holds power. But it's not just about power; it's about finding those commonalities. And secondly, that maybe, and it's something I mentioned earlier, is we could use the technologies themselves to democratize the way we do things. And this is really a really exciting way, is that maybe the technologies can be less supply-driven, more balanced with demand-driven, and that maybe those who actually need them could get access to them. So I think, and let me just, my final statement, which is summarize. What do we want? What purpose? Well, we really want to create and apply new technologies that improve the health and well-being of human beings and the planet. I think we could universally say that would be a good thing. We want those technologies to be accessible to those who need them, so that we can close those stark gaps in health that persist, even in the fourth industrial revolution. And then in this era of dazzling invention, these simple goals surely cannot be left to the realm of science fiction. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Kelly.
I'll show my last slide.
It was definitely worth the wait.
Hell is not, you can't see hell.
Thank you so much. It was worth the wait, and I look forward to watching Space Odyssey on the way home.
Please do, yes.
Please now welcome Undp Dhaliwal. We look forward to hearing some comments on the main themes of the conference from the perspective of UNDP and your own perspective, of course. Please.
Thank you very much. And I learned lessons yesterday and went old school, so no technology for me. So thank you very much. And I have to say, I'm leaving after a day and a half with more questions than I came with. So it's been a very good day and a half. Just to say a little bit about UNDP, we work across 170 countries, but our focus is very much on sustainable development and a focus on improving the lives of the poor in low and middle income countries. And I came into this conversation thinking about, how is it that we harness the benefits of digital for health and well-being? And it was really nice to hear yesterday, I think it was Philip who was talking about well-being also being an important part of the picture. So there are these tremendous opportunities offered by digital, and not just digital in terms of digital health technologies, but digital generally for health and well-being. We heard yesterday from Sridhar, the challenge, of course, is the pace, the velocity, the volume of digital, and the number of stakeholders that are involved in the ecosystem. And I was awake very late last night thinking about the comment about the state. And it's not a benevolent public sector anymore, and I think I'm going to stop talking about public-private because I think as distinct things, because I think in this space there's an incredible sort of blurring of the boundaries, as someone said yesterday. So what does that mean, especially in a context in many of the countries where UNDP works, there is a stark digital gap. There's a digital divide. Many people still don't have access to even the most basic cell phone, forget about a smartphone. So in that context, you have, again, a great inequality in terms of the kinds of technologies we've been hearing about over the last day and have galloping ahead. And galloping ahead at a great pace without policy, regulation, or law to really kind of govern it. So I think we need to move from the governance gap to responsible governance. And what does that mean? And in HIV, we really talked about governance in the context of shared responsibility. And shared responsibility across a complex ecosystem of actors. We have multiple stakeholders, public, private, but the stakeholder that for me has been missing predominantly in the last day and a half is the human being, the individual. We've talked a lot about systems and technologies and money and corporations and governments. Well, I think what really needs to be thought through in this ecosystem is the role of the citizen, the human being. And there are a lot of lessons from HIV, from access to medicines, that I think can give us some important insights. Everything from the Doha Declaration, the issues around IP and access to medicines, to how citizens and affected patients really fought for a more human rights-based and a more humane approach to the worst epidemic the world has ever seen. So the issues around power asymmetry, incentives, states not equaling the same thing as citizens, who cares about the most vulnerable? Who gives them, how do they have a voice at the table and in the conversation on governance? There are a lot of lessons from the HIV response and access to medicines, and I'm going to be thinking about many of those as we go. We also heard, interestingly, yesterday this interesting sort of, I think it was kind of presented as a either or a versus proposition yesterday. You know, is it ethics versus human rights? Is it ethics and philosophy versus human rights? I think of it, the kind of challenge we've heard about over the last day and a half, we need all three. Certainly from UNDP's perspective, there is no sustainable development without the realization of human rights. And human rights apply offline and online. And so that gives us something to think about. But I think at the same time, we need principles from ethics, we need principles of philosophy, we need a more human-centered, value-centered approach to the problem. So what else is needed? So I think we need to move from the technology dominating the conversation to the individual dominating the conversation. We need to focus on agency and well-being. And I say that as someone who leads a health team, so that's very much my bias. And I think what's missing also is who is investing in empowering individuals to understand the technology, to understand the implications of the digital. The funding, and it was interesting this morning, I said to Sakiko, that slide with the six icons, it's clear that the funding is going to facilitating service provision. It's not necessarily going to empowering the patient. It's about going to, creating, it's about the financing, it's about the services and the systems, but it's not about the end user. So again, there's another asymmetry that we need to think about. And we heard, I think, over a number of presentations, the importance of addressing power asymmetries and who deploys the technology. So I'm left with the question, really, we need much more evidence on, does digital always increase access to health services? And does it always increase health and well-being? And unfortunately, too much of the conversation up till now is just the assumption is that it does. And I think we have to really question whether it does, and we have to ask for the evidence. And so I'll declare right now, I'm not an economist. I don't want to offend any economist in the room, but I think we need to, or finance person, we need to move from the tyranny of the economists, and I'm surrounded by this at UNDP, so I have to move a little bit out of this, challenge it a little bit, to looking at social costs, social impact, human costs, human impact. We're human beings, we're not machines, and I think that would really help us to unpack this issue of digital in a more realistic way, especially for people in low and middle income countries. I think there is a great need for regulation, policy, and law. I was at a meeting in Hong Kong a couple of weeks ago of a global platform on digital health, and I can tell you countries are racing ahead with applying these, learning from countries like the US, the UK, Canada, and others, and they're racing ahead with this. So there's a real need for this innovate now and regulate later, which I wrote down, is a really big problem that we need to challenge and we need to do something with. 100 countries, that said, have data privacy laws, but we need some analysis about, do they work in the current context? Are they adequate? Are they appropriate? Clearly, there is some appetite for regulation, legislation. We have the GDPR, we have the EU Convention 108 on personal data, where a number of non-EU countries have also opted in, but is opt-in enough? And I work for the United Nations, after all. I think we need to move from a challenge which is a global, complex, and cuts across borders. If we want to address this kind of a challenge, we need global cooperation. We need global regulation, which is smart, which is giving examples around effective policy, regulation, and legislation in different environments, so that we tilt the balance for greater inclusion and equity. We tilt the balance to a more human-centered approach. There is an urgent need for global coordination and coherence across an ecosystem that is incredibly complex, but it has to be underpinned by human values, by human rights frameworks, by principles of fairness and justice. That's the only way we will get to the solidarity that we need to address this grand challenge. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mandeep, for your call for a more human-centered and value-centered approach to unpacking some of these very complicated issues surrounding digital health. Is there an alarm going on? So I think the question remains really, how do we infuse shared responsibility and what Kelly called goal congruence into into the so-called technological Wild West, as we've been discussing it? And what is the role also for citizens in voicing demands for better health and equity? These are, I think, open questions still. So we have a few more minutes, and we wanted to really open up this conversation about the overarching themes and implications of what we've been discussing, and also the possible next steps for our independent panel on global governance for health to you, the audience. And so please get in line. I know lots of people have things they want to say. Thank you. And we also welcome those who haven't had a chance to say anything yet, to voice their opinion. So we'll start over here. Thank you.
Thank you.
Maybe you can introduce yourself.
Sure.
Yeah, thanks.
My name is Sharon Hamare. I'm with the Open Society Foundation. And I just want to say this has been an incredible morning. It's been such a wealth of knowledge, and not only just the knowledge, but the wisdom. And my question, I guess, to the panelists, but also to people in the room, is what's your plan for impact here? Shomo and Undp gave a real historical sort of reminder stuff in the 70s, the 80s, the 90s. And in fact, it isn't getting any better. And whether I agree or disagree with Rock Health, they've got a plan. Where is civil society? So I'm curious, beyond getting another peer review article, and no disrespect to academia, I am an academic myself, but where is the plan? This is rich. This is incredible what you've unearthed.
Thank you. Does anyone want to address this, or should I take all the questions?
I think let's just take a question.
Yeah, we'll take all the questions first.
Okay. Hi, everyone, again. As we move towards a more digital or digitized version of healthcare and so on, I want to advocate or suggest that it comes not without serious costs. Certainly, the first one I want to say is that developing countries and low-income countries need actually to purchase technology, hardware, and so on. We normally have restricted budgets, and when you put significant amount of that budgetary allocation towards the digital aspects, other resources such as medicine and hiring of doctors and so on may be compromised. So ultimately we may exacerbate inequities, because what we're doing is that we have a lot of the money is being pumped to some of the companies as opposed to the healthcare system. Certainly in my country, and I know throughout the Caribbean where I'm from, a lot of people are employed actually in the health sector. And when we make AI such a big thing, or at least technology, what happens is that a lot of people may no longer be employed. That has tremendous implications for people's well-being. I just want to advocate that that actually, I think, spans throughout. As we evolve into that technological realm, people's employment and well-being and poverty and so on can exacerbate. And finally, I think that we are transferring a lot of control of our health and our societies towards big companies, and I'm wondering to what extent we are now going back to historical legacies of colonization, whereby big countries, especially the US, since most of the companies are here, that they would have greater control over the destiny of the rest of the world.
And how do you think the panel should address this? Manjari.
So I am an academic, so this is going to disappoint the OSF representative here. But one of the things I've been thinking about is what should be an agenda for social science research going ahead, given all the incredible insights that we have gained over the day and a half. So one thing which I see, and I think some of this is already taking place, but we could do more of, is do more work on comparative legal frameworks and regulatory frameworks that are out there and that are being developed by different countries around data protection, but also trade, antitrust, taxation, innovation law. And I think we have historical examples of South-to-South learning, especially around patent law, when a lot of developing countries were pushed to become TRIPS compliant, and countries like India, and then there were others, became exemplars and provided models which were then used, not used, so on and so forth. So I think something similar where we do comparative work on frameworks of law would be really helpful, law and regulation. It's also true that when academics talk about change that is citizen-driven, user-sensitive, equity-sensitive, etc., it doesn't go very far because it's very difficult to come up with alternate frameworks from thin air. So more work, and maybe this was just our bias in designing the program for this conference, more work on success stories or the kinds of things we would like to see. So, Rajiv was talking about this earlier, alternate technology platforms like Jaipur Foot, which actually do start from ground up. What Jashodhara mentioned, which is people's movement-based accountability mechanisms for information, ways of shaping private actor actions, whether it be prize funds or patent pools, and studying more closely how they've worked, they've not worked, etc. The third area which I would find very interesting is, there are these host of actors like governments, World Bank, Gates, USAID, UNICEF, which have adopted a whole host of digital technologies for health. And most of these actors are well-meaning actors. They would be completely on board when it comes to goals of equity, poverty alleviation, so on and so forth. So a kind of puzzle is what drives them to choose these tools that they do choose, which then we academics and anthropologists go around showing don't work. So studying these institutions and engaging these institutions more carefully to make more transparent their logics of selecting particular programs, logics of financing, financialization, but also kind of sociology of institutions. Because I think these are precisely the actors that can change and do things differently. So more social science work on this kind of institutional sociology would also be useful.
Thank you very much, Manjari. Please.
Yeah, it's, this morning, Elizabeth and her presentation actually reminds me of the work done by Emil Durkheim, a century ago, when in the book, Le Suicide, and he specifically talked about why there was a rise and increase in the suicide in cities. Especially, it's because of the breakdown of our whole social solidarity system. It's because we have been so individuated and individualized when the Industrial Revolution came along. And going back on that, and I have been thinking that, whether there's the effect of technology, and especially this new machine designed by Amazon to give you a diagnosis of, to say that you are actually unwell or under weather, and this kind of thing, whether is it truly the cause or the symptom, and this is truly an issue when we think about when technology has been so pervasive and invasive in our life, whether we are blaming or putting the blame on those technology companies or on ourselves, actually. Because, this is, for me, we let those technology to take control of our life, and we actually play a part in that. And that actually has something to do with mobile technology. Nowadays, it seems that we have been so much conditioned by the way we use mobile technology. We actually has lost the capacity to start a conversation, especially with strangers. So this is somehow diminishing our humanity. So we are handing over this power of decision making to technology, and those companies actually are simply taking advantage of this. So this is truly something we need to think about. It's a deeper level. It's not just about technology, but also more importantly, how our humanity can be reimagined in the new era to come.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. I had a couple of questions, but I want to kind of sum up because the session had that. And before that, I didn't mention my background, so I think it's kind of relevant that some of the questions or the comments which I put is influenced from the background of the evolution I as a researcher and also as an activist now. So being an engineer, a computer engineer, internet engineer, a sociologist, and an STS researcher. So this whole idea or two key themes I see very crucial. That is related to what Elizabeth presented on AI. So the whole idea of coding, or what I see human shaping of algorithm, and how the AI is learning from that human biases, stigma, gender being ingrained in that. And the second notion of that, which Manjari already highlighted, we had a brief discussion on that. But I see in this whole discourse, I think Gandhi is very important because, and it's kind of strange because nobody mentioned about Gandhi. And I think many people have this wrong impression that Gandhi was against technology. But I would rather say that Gandhi was more of a person who was more close to appropriate and intermediate technology. That's also coming from Schumacher's work, Small is Beautiful. So then my question or my comment is also that can the new emerging technologies can be considered in a term of appropriate technology? Because cost factor is there. If I talk about AI or blockchains, the cost of computing power is so high that can it be thought that appropriate AI technologies, appropriate digital health technologies can be applied in the notion of village? And that comes to the point which Padmashri was making. So who owns the narratives? So if these alternate things will exist, or if they can exist, maybe they can change the ownership of narrative, because now it's mostly market driven. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you for your comment. Yeah, please go ahead. I'm doing. Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. Fascinating presentations. Everything is connected, literally. So I think any kind of recommendations or whatever is going to come out of this panel needs to take this into consideration. And we have seen that in the presentations yesterday, but also today. There is a new chapter of rethinking reality. It's not just about more or less of one thing or another, but it's about completely reshaping how we consider it. And that's in the domain of economics, where it's no longer about growth, but where there's a growing understanding that it's not about more of the same, but about doing it differently. So,
thank you for your comment. Laurie.
Hey, good afternoon. My name is Rody Sopralis. I'm an alumnus of the Julian J. Studley graduate programs right here at the New School. Thank you all so much for coming today. You know, for the last year, I've been involved with an NGO called the Maya Traditions Foundation. We work with indigenous women down in Guatemala. And one major challenge that I feel ties into the human-centered approach and, you know, works towards an inclusive future in health technology is a matter of language. And one thing that's been really kind of a barrier to progress there for us, for our peers down there at Pueblo a Pueblo, Maya families, et cetera, and for other groups is the matter of certain phrases with regards to technology, regulation, and your rights as a human being and citizen are hard to translate from a widely spoken language from people who understand the terms to those who don't. So how do we begin approaching that from the perspective of it's hard enough to do that? Now we have to do that for individuals who may not speak the national language, as in Guatemala, where there are 28 Mayan languages spoken. Some groups have been isolated for so long that they have yet to pick up Spanish widely. So that's my question to this panel and to everybody here.
Thank you. Nora, you maybe got tired of standing, or do you we'd like to hear what you had to say. Since you were one of the few people who really showed us also what some of these technologies feel like for individuals, I think it would be interesting to hear your comment.
Go ahead. So, Michael, I'm not sure this leads us anywhere, but
well done.
Which is why I sat down. But I was thinking about two kind of themes that have emerged throughout the panels in this conference, and the first is the theme of good intentions and where good intentions go wrong, but also the fact that good intentions exist in a lot of these domains. And I think that might be powerful, and that might be something that we can harness, and to sort of ask people to aspire to their good intentions. So at our last meetings in Oslo, some of our colleagues talked about their work on the NGO Code of Conduct for NGOs working in human resources for health. And I think that might be one place where we could carry this to, as a sort of voluntary code that sort of asks people to step up to their best intentions. On the other hand, the other kind of persistent theme that has emerged is technology breaking and not working and not performing as expected. And so I wonder if there's also something productive there, to take breaks, to take glitches, and to use them to reflect on what technology gives and what it also takes away from us. And so I don't know where that takes us. But.
Thank you very much. Yashodra and then Sakiko finally.
Thanks. I'd just like to speak to something that came up in a previous conference I was at of the Global Development Network, where the question of democracy and digital technologies was discussed in some depth. And one of the conclusions from that particular panel was that in authoritarian regimes, the use of digital technologies can really destroy democracy. And we are seeing authoritarian regimes emerge more and more across the globe. And this conference is about political determinants. And I'm assuming that we are all very conscious of the politics, the trends in politics that we are seeing across the globe. And as I mentioned yesterday, that in a case like ours, where our government has been elected almost significantly owing to the interventions by a technology like Facebook and how it manipulated people's understanding, I am actually unsure about the intention and the capacity of the state to regulate these technologies, especially their predatory aspects. I'm also unsure, as we have all discussed, that technology in industry cannot regulate itself, because we've discussed the problematic of this code of ethics and whether it's human rights or not human rights, etc. So I would actually feel that we do need to engage much more with the kind of people's movements that have come up, with the kind of citizen organizing that has come up to raise questions across the globe on many of the issues that we've talked about. And in terms of going forward, I do feel that beyond publishing and research, we do need to find ways to engage with and strengthen some of those movements with the kind of findings that we've been discussing here. So really to deepen our engagement with citizenship, with the struggles for democracy, and to be very mindful, as I've said yesterday, of the limitations of relying completely on the state to awaken like a sleeping giant with complete power. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yashodhara. And Sakiko, finally.
I just wanted to have raise one question. And I don't want to put Mandeep on the spot because she's from the UN. But once again, thinking about the histories of 20th century struggles on technology, and really Mandeep has been very much in the forefront of these fighting for greater technological access. She was, pushed forward the HIV and the law, challenging basically IP. She, put forward the Secretary General's high-level panel on access to medicines and innovation. I mean, all of these incredibly progressive agendas that have been pursued within UN fora and through these various these processes where the UN itself has tried to pursue, various different organizations of the UN pursue a more progressive agenda on technology. But now, so where is that going? I mean, we talk about the national public sector, right? But what about the global public sector? So intergovernmental institutions. WHO has, produced new guidelines. The UN Secretary General has set up a high-level panel on technology cooperation. Where is the movement? I mean, so within the UN, are there impulses? I think so. That's another. So as I said, I don't want to put Mandeep on the spot to answer this question, but I think we should also be looking at these intergovernmental negotiating spaces where there will be tremendously important challenge and potential for moving ahead with some kind of global governance dialogues.
Thank you, Sakiko. So we have to close in 5 minutes, which, you do the maths, speakers. You have a very short time to provide some final comments. We're going to start with you, Jomo, to give your final thoughts in response to those comments.
Thank you. let me make 3 comments. One in response to Shamila's question of what is the plan. I think...
Thank you for addressing that.
I think there are 2 levels, basically, if I can be crude about it, wish to operate. One is at the global level, and some of the responses to Sakiko's challenge. There are a number of issues which I identified in my remarks about what needs urgent attention, and despite Jashodra's misgivings, I think state capacities need to be significantly enhanced, especially in the developing countries. But with provisos, and I think that's the challenge, and there's no universal blueprint about how that is to be achieved. At the international level, I think there are some struggles which are going on. One of the concerns I have is that many of the truly multilateral institutions are not multilateral anymore. This whole PPP, public-private partnership business has taken over the world. And the UN, unfortunately, has been very much part of it in the last couple of decades. The second point is about learning from each other. I can't remember who raised it, but peer learning is very important. Unfortunately, the few institutions for peer learning, particularly among developing countries, have basically are being undermined as we speak. Okay, the South Centre's capacity has dropped, and Tabum Beki is the chairman of the South Centre now. The South Centre's capacity has dropped by 1/3 within a year, and yeah, Montes was talking about this yesterday. But there are many other examples, and that's one of the few examples. RIS in India, which started off as the research wing of the non-aligned movement, is, I don't know what it is now, but it certainly is not the research wing of anything besides the Indian Trade Ministry. So we basically have very few institutions. Those few institutions are diminishing, and the few progressive forces which are left really need to do much more to bolster it. And I think this is very much needed. The last is that about half a century ago, there was a fairly significant movement in some parts of the world of what was called science for the people, etc., etc. I think that basic ethics is still very much needed to help to provide an ethical milieu for a lot of the work which we do. That right now is almost voiceless. There's almost nobody who talks about those kinds of things anymore. And I think we need to have some champions for that. I'm not sure whether any of the crop of Nobel laureates and so on would fit the bill, but I think we desperately need some. Let me give you an example.
So we have.
Just a decade ago, the man who won the World Food Prize is an Oromo from the eastern part of Ethiopia who had done research in exile in Sudan and discovered through crossbreeding a drought-resistant sorghum. And he refused. He was given a very prestigious professorship at Purdue University. He refused to patent it. And he said there's absolutely no reason to patent this. And I think what we need are champions like that to basically set a different moral example. And, the Gandhis for our times, if you will. And that is, I think, what is needed. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It resonates with Nora's plea, really, to live up to the good intentions. Thank you. Mandeep, yes, please.
Yeah, just to come back to Sakiko's question, I mean, I think there are some opportunities in the next, in the next year as the United Nations celebrates its 75th anniversary, and the SG has just kicked off a global dialogue where he wants to hear from people about how the UN should remain the UN for the people as opposed to other interests. And I think that's a great opportunity to take the findings of this high-level panel on digital cooperation and really look at people's movements and see how we can bring those together to ensure that the UN has the capacity to support countries to deal with some of these big modern challenges of our time. So I think that's one opportunity. I think the UN should have its feet held to the fire around this high-level panel what's the plan, really? How are they going to implement these recommendations, which many of the recommendations address so many of the issues that were raised over the last day and a half. I have to say, this is being recorded, right? But I'm going to say it anyway. We put out a lot of reports at the UN sometimes, but there isn't a lot of follow-up, and I think there needs to be follow-up on this one because it is really, really critical that we address, especially the issue around the global cooperation around regulation, legislation, and policy. And I think pushing us to do that through the global dialogue and through other spaces would be really critical. And somebody asked the question about what drives the institutions to select particular tools and technologies. I mean, I can tell you again, at UNDP, our intention is good because the intention is, oh my God, countries are being, they're having to deal with this issue of digital, and it's, ranging from, oh, I must have these digital technologies because I don't want to be left behind, to companies just showing up and kind of asserting themselves with these countries. And how do we equip developing countries to be part of the dialogue in a way that benefits their citizens? So that's where we come from. But I realize, listening over the last day and a half, there's so much more to the conversation that we don't know. We're kind of naive interlocutors, really, in a sense, and we need to really think about what how we're supporting countries to make these decisions in a way that is going to benefit people in developing countries. So I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Mandeep. And now Kelly, final word from Kelly.
Okay, I'll be quick. Two very quick points. One is that I understand why there's a feeling of neocolonialism, and totally understandable. But I think we have to recognize, and I think I support Susan Sell's comment. Things are different, but they're not necessarily better different, right? Yeah. It's not just state versus market, north-south, U.S. versus the world anymore. The world economy has really changed. Our lives are very much driven by corporations, absolutely. So we need to understand those commercial determinants of health. And within those, the technological determinants of health, I think Nora called it, which comes to the issue of who's to blame. I think you might have said that we're culpable. I would remind you that there's both agency and structure in this issue, and that our choices are defined by the societies around us. So we're not, and there's addiction involved in technologies, right? We all know that. So it's not just a simple thing of let's just grab control back again. And the final point is about digital technologies and democracy. I skipped over a slide showing a book cover, The Death of the Gods, the New Global Power Grab. And Carl Miller talks about how the internet has brought about profound power shifts in a range of sectors. In law enforcement, you think about hackers and cyber attacks. In the media, you think about social media influencers. In politics, think about the Arab Spring and the Extinction Rebellion. Those are not necessarily all good or bad, but they are examples of power shifts. And so I think there is opportunity for both good and bad in terms of recalibrating who holds power.
Thank you very much, Kelly. And I think all the presentations together, I think it was Emmanuel who said that it's really exposed the new rules of the game, and also raised the question of how can we really change the rules in favor of health equity. So we have to finish now. I'd like to ask you to help me thank the panel for their closing remarks, which were very thoughtful.
We are starting the session, the final panel, which is going to be on governance, which in many respects is bringing together